Well, hello and welcome to session 3. In this week's study time, we're going to be talking about how to plant and propagate our fruit. We know that almost every fruit begins as a seed. The seed is the small beginning. I spent a portion of my career as a labor and delivery nurse, and when we think of human life knitted together in the mother's womb, even that little baby, before it can enter into this world, it had to begin as a seed. The creativity of our mighty God just never ceases to amaze me. And when I think about the wonderful masterpiece of the body of us as women and just what he's just so intricately created us to be able to do, I just am in awe of his handiwork. But for most women of childbearing age, there is a natural rhythm and cadence that our bodies follow to prepare to bring that new life into the world. I'm going to get a little scientific on you here because I have a science background and I just geek out about science things. But first of all, each month inside our ovaries, a group of eggs starts to grow in tiny fluid-filled sacs called follicles. And eventually, one of those eggs will erupt from that follicle, and that's known as ovulation. Then, after the egg leaves the follicle, it'll eventually travel to one of 2 fallopian tubes. And it actually only stays there for about 24 hours. And while it's there, it's waiting for a single sperm to fertilize it. And if one sperm does manage to make its way to the egg, it will go ahead and burrow its way in, and then at the instant of fertilization, a baby's genes and sex are set. If the sperm has a Y chromosome, it'll be a boy. And if it has an X, it'll be a girl. And then deep in the darkness and the seclusion of the womb, life begins to take shape and form. Most women don't actually realize that they're pregnant until about the first few weeks have passed. And then by the end of the 4th week of pregnancy, the baby inside is no bigger than a poppy seed. A poppy seed. Those are those little suckers that get stuck in your teeth all the time when you eat those everything bagels, right? But the 5th week of gestation, the baby's no bigger than an apple seed, even secluded in the womb, deep in obscurity. We are a seed. We have promise. And there is some precious development that happens when you're deep in obscurity. I know we use that word, and sometimes we don't always think about the depth of meaning that it has. But obscurity is defined as the state of being unknown, inconspicuous, unimportant, the quality of being difficult to understand, a thing that is unclear or difficult to know. Synonyms include insignificance, anonymity, lack of fame, honor or recognition, ingloriousness, limbo, mystery. Have any of you guys ever felt any of those things? I know I have. I'm certain that some of you might have felt like you've been pregnant with a promise or a seed that's been planted deep inside of you for a really long time. And maybe you felt like you're in limbo because you've been tucked away in obscurity for a while. But here's the thing. Pregnancy is a process. It's a promise of newness to come, yes, eventually. But just like that baby in the womb, if we give birth to it too soon or too late, there's no viability of life. And that dream or that seed that's been implanted within you, it has to take the appropriate time to develop. I think about the heroes of the Bible. You know, some of them had to wait a really long time to get their God-given promises fulfilled. And, you know, when we read them, we see the end of the story, and we're like, okay, that's the end of the story. But when they were in the middle of it, it was a while for some of them. Think about Noah. It was a really long time. I mean, decades between him picking up that first piece of gopher wood And then that first molecule of water falling from the sky. And then when he finally does get on the ark, in Genesis 7, he was 600 years old. And then by the time that he was able to come out and tap his toe on dry land, it was a whole nother year later. He was 601 by the time he was finally able to begin again. And then we've got Abraham, whose name actually means the father of many nations. He and his wife Sarah had to wait 25 years for the promise to be fulfilled, for them to actually have their first child, Isaac. And then there's Rebekah. She waited 20 years before she finally was able to become a mother. And then when she did become a mother, she gave birth to twins, Jacob and Esau. Moses, a lot of us know his story, but he wandered in the wilderness for 40 years before he was finally able to lead the Israelites out of captivity. And then once they were freed, they wandered in the wilderness for another 40 years before they were able to reach the promised land, which, by the way, was a land that Moses was only able to see from afar. He had to wait a really long time. Hannah, she waited years for the promise of a son to be fulfilled. And when she did have him, she named him Samuel. And Samuel played a mighty part in the nation of Israel. And then there was David. He waited nearly 15 years between Samuel, Hannah's Samuel, when he anointed David to be the eventual king. And then by the time he finally did take the throne after Saul's death, there was 15 years between the anointing and then the throne. He waited a long time. And then years later in David's life, he felt this call. A seed was implanted in his heart and his spirit to go ahead and build the temple, get the construction and the plans for the temple set. And so he started doing that. And then the Lord said, no, you're not going to actually see the fulfillment of this temple being built. And so instead, he said, I'm going to have your son, Solomon, be the one to build the temple. Isn't that how it goes for us sometimes too? We plant seeds now that we may never witness the fruit of in our lives. And see, all of those examples were just ones from the Old Testament. There's so many more in the Bible when we read. And when we read these stories, we read the full thing in its entirety from beginning to end, and we know how the story ends up. And we know that these people eventually get to their promise and get it fulfilled. It's actually a technique in the literary world known as dramatic irony. And it's when the audience or the reader knows more than the character does. It creates tension and suspense. And I imagine all of those people felt those same things. But here's the thing, they weren't characters in a fictional book. They were real people with real lives. And I bet they felt tension and suspense when they were living in the middle of their unknown. So when you and I are waiting for our promise to take root and begin to develop, it can be uncomfortable and frustrating too. Sometimes we feel like God's delay is his denial because we don't know what he's up to behind the scenes. And it can feel like there's little to nothing that we can do to move forward. But when we look at our situation through the lens of faith, we can see that in the middle of little and nothing, God always directs us to do something. And like Psalm 37:3 says, trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and cultivate faithfulness. That's what it takes for our seeds to prosper too. When we trust in the Lord, we trust his character and we trust his promises, and then we do our part too. We have to cultivate faithfulness. The word that the psalmist used for that phrase, to cultivate faithfulness, is the Hebrew word ra'ah. And it's the same word used to describe how a shepherd tends to his flock. So we know then that it's not a passive process. It takes effort on our part. So my question is, whatever dream God's planted inside of you, whatever seed that's been deposited, even if it's been dormant for a while, whatever that small beginning, you've got to do your part to cultivate it. That's what this fruit-bearing journey is. It's a partnership with the Lord. 1 Corinthians 3, 7 through 9 says, it's not important who does the planting or who does the watering. What's important is that God makes the seeds grow. The one who plants and the one who waters work together with the same purpose, and both will be rewarded for their own hard work. For we are both God's workers. And when we look at that phrase, God's workers, some versions actually say we are co-workers in God's service. That phrase, God's workers, it's translated from synergios, and it means to work together, to be a partner in labor. We have to do our part to bring forth or to deliver the fruit of our lives. Now, I want to go back to the story with Solomon and the temple. See, David, the father, planted the seed. And then Solomon, the son, fulfilled that dream, and he completed the temple around 957 BC. Then, in 586 BC, the Babylonians captured Jerusalem and destroyed that temple. And then 2 Chronicles 36:19 says, they set fire to God's temple and broke down the wall of Jerusalem. They burned all of the palaces and destroyed everything of value there. Those Israelites who managed to survive that bloodbath, they were then exiled for years. And then decades later, there was a man named Zerubbabel. He became the leader of the tribe of Judah. And he was part of that first wave of Jewish exiles to return back to Jerusalem. And right away, he felt the call. The seed was planted to start rebuilding the temple again. One of our key verses from this week is Zechariah 4:10, and it says, do not despise these small beginnings, for the Lord rejoices to see the work begin, to see the plumb line in Zerubbabel's hand. You see, Zerubbabel, he was actually a descendant of David. He was within that same royal lineage. And he returned to Jerusalem to build the temple and to rekindle this messianic hope. And it actually took him 2 years just to rebuild the foundation. It was an enormous undertaking. And then, once the construction did begin, it was delayed then for another 17 years. And it sat unfinished. Just the foundation sat there for 17 years. And maybe that's what you've been experiencing too. Perhaps it's not that you're afraid to deliver the calling, but instead you're hesitant to move forward because of opposition on the other side and what lies ahead. But see, God, in his graciousness and his sovereignty, he didn't leave Zerubbabel in obscurity forever, and he won't leave you there either. He sent his prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, to encourage and support him in his time of need. At one point, Zechariah even tells Zerubbabel that it's not by your power and not by your might, but it's by the Spirit of the Lord that you're going to overcome these obstacles. So then he gets this reassurance by this divine provision that the work that he was putting his hands to do, it would be fulfilled. And then he began again, and the work on the temple, it resumed. And then 4 years later, the second temple was finally completed. Talk about a long process, right? But what I love about that passage in Zechariah is that the Lord didn't wait until the work was finished. He rejoiced to see the plumb line in Zerubbabel's hand. Do you know what a plumb line is? My friend, she's an engineer, and she said that they use this routinely in their construction design. But it's got this weight, and it's held on a vertical point from a string, and it makes sure that the structure is centered. The plumb line, look, it's so small. It's not huge. He didn't wait to see that last stone be put in place in the wall to say, job well done. No, he rejoiced when he saw the tool in his hand. Just the tool allowed the Lord to rejoice over the work that he was beginning. I love that Zerubbabel was centering his life on the will of God first. And when it comes to you and me and those things that we've been pregnant with for a really long time, our small beginnings, God rejoices when we center our intentions on him first, and then we take that next step too. When we trust him, and then we do our part. When we do that next step too. You know what else is just so beautiful about the story with Zerubbabel and his faithfulness to rebuild that temple? There were so many priests and actually Levites of that time that they had actually seen Solomon's temple. They had actually experienced the majesty and the grandeur of Solomon's temple. And when they saw that foundation being built, they lamented, like, deep groans over the fact that it was going to pale in comparison to Solomon's majestic temple. But here's the thing. Even then, there were haters. Even then, there were people that just didn't understand the dream, and that's why who we surround ourselves with, it matters. It affects us, and it affects what we do with our lives. And because the environment that we plant our seed in, it affects our fruit. And here's what God did, though. I love it. He flipped the script, and he promised a greater glory. He said in Haggai 2:9, the future glory of this temple, Zerubbabel's temple, will be greater than its past glory, Solomon's temple. And then he went on to say, and in this place he would bring peace. See, Zerubbabel's temple, it was not as outwardly impressive as Solomon's. And maybe you've looked at your life and you've compared it to friends on social media, or people that their houses are all put together, or their spouses look like they are the husband from heaven. You know, when we compare our lives to others, you know, like, oh, my platform or my appearance, or it's not as good as hers or so-and-so. And that's what comparison does. It kills the calling on our lives. Because when we look at the story of Zerubbabel's life and the story of the temple that he built, it was not as ornate. It wasn't. It wasn't as big or as splendid as Solomon's, but it did contain a greater glory. Jesus Christ, the Messiah, himself walked the courts of the temple that Zerubbabel built. Solomon's temple never received a visit from the Messiah, but Zerubbabel's did. And that's what he meant by the present glory would be greater than the former glory. See, even through seasons of darkness and obscurity, when we're living in our own dramatic irony, we too can move forward with apprehension and suspense. Keep cultivating faithfulness because we can trust that he is sovereign and he is already in our tomorrows, and so he knows the end of our story too. If we are obedient to do our part and be like that pregnant mama, we won't stay pregnant forever. And after that soon-to-be mama has endured 40 weeks, which, by the way, if you study 40 out, it's a number of completion. When she's endured those 40 weeks of bloating and sleepless nights and random pains and ever-present trips to the bathroom, all-encompassing discomfort, that's when she knows the life inside of her is ready. And some of you are in that place too, spiritually, maybe physically too, where you've been holding on to a dream for too long, and it's time. You're ready. But it's just like that pregnant mama, in that readiness, we've got to be prepared to do our part for the fruit to be produced. So I pray that you've been encouraged to plant good seeds, remembering that even the small and seemingly insignificant acts, they matter. I pray that you're reminded how Jesus loved upside-down theology, where less is more, and smaller becomes bigger, and man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a parable that embodies this whole principle of upside-down theology. In Matthew 13:31 through 32, Jesus said, "The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed planted in a field. It's the smallest of all the seeds, but it becomes the largest of garden plants, and it grows into a tree, and birds come and make nests in its branches." See, we cannot despise our small beginnings. So often we tend to think that only people on platforms do real ministry, but that simply isn't true. It's the mama singing songs about Jesus while she's in the thick of diapering and nap time and feedings and feeling like she's living the same day over and over again. But what happens when that baby grows up, they've got a song rooted in their heart. It's that grandmother praying and interceding for her grandchildren and her adult children. And those prayers, they impact change, and they are forever these people that they pray over, they're forever impacted for the good. It's the woman who says yes to volunteer in her community and use her gifts and her talents, never knowing the experience that she'll gain from that time will be a launch pad for the next best thing that God has for her. It's the 60-something-year-old veteran of the faith who's mentoring a 30-something woman who's just hungry to know Jesus more. And that mentor, she can't see the long-term seeds of her discipleship, but generations will look back on that moment when those two ladies sat across the table sipping coffee, talking about Jesus. It's the teenager who doesn't know that what she wants to do with her future yet, but she commits a summer and she volunteers at a shelter, and then her heart starts to break for what she sees. And then she gets a fire in her belly to do something, anything for good, for the lost and the hurting. And it's the woman who's been faithfully leading Bible study year after year. She's shown up. She's dealt with the loss. She's dealt with the heartache and the grief and the sorrow, and she's prayed people through those points in their lives. And she's been an anchor in the middle of their storms, and she's clung to the Lord in her own. It's those small seeds. It's those seemingly small beginnings that will someday add up to monumental endings. We just have to remember to trust God, to do good, and to cultivate faithfulness, and He will take care of the rest.